Trust is a fragile thing. You can spend years building it, brick by careful brick, only to watch it crumble in the space of a single phone conversation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 8 years of marriage, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. David was the guy who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, who remembered my favorite Thai restaurant when I'd had a rough day with my third graders, who still held my hand during movies. He was reliable, predictable, safe. Until those phone calls started, and I discovered that the man I'd been sharing a bed with was a complete stranger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about teaching 8 and 9-year-olds is that you develop a sixth sense for when something's not quite right. Maybe it's the way little Tommy suddenly stops making eye contact when you ask about his homework, or how Sarah Jane fidgets with her backpack straps when she claims she forgot her lunch money again. After 6 years in the classroom at Riverside Elementary, I'd learned to trust that instinct. Children aren't good liars yet, thank goodness. Adults, as I would soon discover, are much more skilled at deception. My days had a rhythm that I cherished. Up at 6:15, coffee brewing while I reviewed lesson plans for the day. David would stumble downstairs around 7, hair still messy from sleep, grabbing his travel mug and kissing my cheek before heading to Riverside Auto Sales. I'd arrive at school by 7:30, unlock my classroom with the key ring David had given me for our 3rd anniversary, the one with the little apple charm that said "World's Best Teacher." The morning would disappear in a blur of multiplication tables, reading groups, and playground duty. Lunch meant 20 minutes of adult conversation with my colleague and best friend Jen Rodriguez, usually spent comparing notes about our students or planning our weekend girls' nights. The afternoon brought more lessons, parent emails, and the controlled chaos of dismissal. By 4 o'clock, I'd be grading papers at my desk, red pen in hand, trying to decipher whether Marcus had written cat or bat in his spelling test. Home by 5:15, where I'd start dinner while David finished up at the dealership. He usually walked through our front door on Maple Street by 6:30, loosening his tie and asking about my day, while I stirred whatever was simmering on the stove. This was our life, and I loved the predictability of it. There's something deeply satisfying about a routine that works, about knowing your place in the world and feeling secure in it. David would tell me about difficult customers, or celebrate when he closed a big sale on a truck or SUV. I'd share the funny things my students said, like when 8-year-old Emma asked if teachers lived at school overnight, or when Marcus informed me that his mom said I was pretty for a teacher, which apparently was quite the compliment in his household. Our evenings were quiet and comfortable. David would flip through sports channels while I graded more papers on the couch beside him, my legs tucked under me, occasionally reading him particularly creative answers from my students' science tests. We'd talk about our plans for the weekend, debate whether to try the new Mexican restaurant downtown, or discuss our ongoing house projects. The guest bedroom had been waiting for fresh paint for 6 months, but somehow there was always something else that needed attention first. Weekends meant farmers market visits, where David would charm the vendors while I selected vegetables for the week. He had this gift for making people smile, remembering details about their lives that I'd completely forgotten. Mrs. Henderson, who sold the best tomatoes in 3 counties, always asked about his mother, Carol. Jake, the young man with the organic honey stand, would light up when David asked about his girlfriend's nursing school progress. Watching my husband navigate these interactions filled me with pride. He cared about people, genuinely cared, and it showed. Sunday afternoons were for grocery shopping, meal prep, and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from knowing someone so well that conversation isn't always necessary. We developed a system at the store over the years. David handled the heavy items and anything from the deli counter, while I focused on produce and the carefully planned list I'd made based on our weekly menu. He'd sneak cookies into the cart when he thought I wasn't looking, and I'd pretend not to notice, the same way I pretended not to see him stealing bites of cookie dough when I baked on rainy afternoons. Money wasn't abundant, but it was sufficient. My teacher's salary provided stability, while David's commission-based income at the auto dealership created fluctuations that we'd learned to navigate. Good months meant dinner out and maybe a weekend trip to the coast. Lean months meant more home-cooked meals and movie nights on the couch. We'd been trying to have a baby for 2 years, and the fertility specialist visits were straining our budget. But we managed. I handled most of the bills and financial planning, not because David couldn't, but because I enjoyed the organization of it. Spreadsheets and budget categories gave me the same satisfaction that a perfectly organized lesson plan did. The phone calls started in March, just as the cherry trees on our street were beginning to bloom. At first, they seemed perfectly innocent. David's phone would ring during dinner, and he'd glance at the screen with a slight frown before declining the call. "Unknown number," he'd explain, returning to his story about the elderly couple who'd spent 3 hours deciding between two nearly identical sedans. Probably some telemarketer trying to sell extended warranties. But the calls persisted, always at the same time, always during our dinner hour. After the third or fourth occurrence, David started answering them, but briefly. "Hello? Sorry, you've got the wrong number." Click. Back to dinner. Back to our conversation about whether we should plant tomatoes or peppers in the sunny corner of the backyard this year. The pattern shifted gradually, so subtly that I almost didn't notice. The calls went from declined to briefly answered to longer conversations. David would excuse himself from the table, stepping out onto our back porch with his phone pressed to his ear. Through the kitchen window, I could see him pacing on the wooden deck we'd stained together last summer, his free hand gesturing as he spoke. When he returned, usually 10 or 15 minutes later, he'd offer the same explanation. "Work stuff. You know how it is with customers who want to negotiate after hours." This made sense, or at least I convinced myself it made sense. Car sales was a competitive business, and David had always been willing to go the extra mile for a potential buyer. He'd stayed late to accommodate test drives, made calls on weekends to follow up on leads, even met customers at the lot on Sundays when they couldn't make it during regular business hours. His dedication was one of the things I admired about him. While some of his colleagues punched out at 5 and forgot about work until the next morning, David understood that building relationships meant being available when people needed him. But something felt different about these particular calls. Maybe it was the way his voice changed when he answered, softer somehow, more intimate than his usual professional tone. Or perhaps it was how he'd pause before explaining them, that split second of hesitation that made me look up from my grading or dinner preparation. Teachers develop an ear for when explanations don't quite ring true, and David's explanations were starting to sound rehearsed. The frequency increased through April. What had been 2 or 3 calls per week became nearly nightly occurrences, always around 7 or 8 in the evening, always requiring David to step outside for privacy, always lasting longer than seemed necessary for simple customer follow-ups. I found myself watching the clock as dinner time approached, wondering if tonight would bring another mysterious conversation on the back porch. I tried to push down the questions that were starting to bubble up in my mind. David had never given me reason to doubt him. In 8 years of marriage, he'd been faithful, honest, and devoted. He still brought me flowers from the grocery store on random Wednesdays, still made sure my car had gas when I was running late for work, still listened patiently when I needed to vent about challenging parents or difficult administrators. The man who remembered that I preferred my coffee with just a splash of cream, and who never failed to record my favorite cooking shows when I worked late grading papers, wasn't the kind of person who would deceive me. But the doubt, once planted, began to grow. I started paying closer attention to his body language during these mysterious calls. The way he'd run his hand through his dark hair when he thought no one was watching. How he'd lean against the porch railing, his shoulders relaxed in a way they never were during actual work conversations. The soft laugh I sometimes caught through the window, warm and genuine, different from his polite customer service chuckle. During our 8 years together, I'd learned to read David's moods and expressions like a favorite book. I knew the crease between his eyebrows that appeared when he was worried about making his monthly sales quota. I recognized the particular way he'd massage his temples after dealing with his demanding manager, Frank, who had strong opinions about everything from follow-up timing to showroom organization. I could distinguish between his difficult customer voice and his potential big sale voice without even hearing the words being spoken. These new phone conversations didn't match any of the patterns I'd come to know. His voice during these calls carried a warmth and ease that reminded me of how he talked to his mother, Carol, or how he'd spoken to me during our early dating days when every conversation felt precious and full of possibility. It was the voice of someone who was genuinely happy to hear from the person on the other end of the line. May arrived with unseasonably warm weather, and an increase in both the frequency and duration of David's mysterious calls. What had been 15-minute conversations were now stretching to half an hour or more. Our dinner routine, once a sacred time for connection and conversation, became increasingly interrupted. I'd find myself eating alone at our kitchen table, reheating David's plate when he finally returned from the porch with apologies and explanations that felt increasingly hollow. "Sorry, honey," he'd say, sliding back into his chair and picking up his fork. "Mrs. Patterson is thinking about upgrading to a larger SUV, but she's got a million questions about financing options. You know how these big purchases can make people nervous." I'd nod and smile, asking appropriate follow-up questions about Mrs. Patterson's automotive needs, while internally wondering why customer service calls had become so frequent and so lengthy. David had been in car sales for 6 years. He was good at his job, respected by his colleagues, trusted by his manager. In all that time, I'd never known him to spend so much time on after-hours customer calls. The doubt was becoming harder to ignore, settling in my chest like a persistent ache. I found myself distracted during lessons, losing my train of thought while explaining fractions to my third graders. Jen noticed my preoccupation during lunch one Tuesday, setting down her sandwich and studying my face with the concern that comes from years of friendship. "You've been somewhere else lately," she observed, her dark eyes serious behind her glasses. "Everything okay at home?" I almost told her then, almost voiced the suspicions that were keeping me awake at night. But what would I say? That my husband was taking phone calls? That he stepped outside for privacy? When I tried to articulate my concerns, they sounded paranoid and petty, the worries of an insecure wife who was imagining problems where none existed. "Just tired," I said instead, forcing a smile that felt stiff and unnatural. "You know how the end of the school year gets. Between finalizing grades and planning for next year, I feel like I'm drowning in paperwork." Jen accepted this explanation, but I caught her watching me more carefully over the following days, ready to listen if I decided to open up. Her friendship meant everything to me, but I wasn't ready to give voice to fears that I hoped were unfounded. Saying the words out loud would make them real, and I wasn't prepared for that reality. At home, I began paying closer attention to David's phone habits. I noticed how he'd check his messages more frequently, sometimes smiling at the screen in a way that made my stomach clench with an emotion I didn't want to name. He'd started keeping his phone face down on surfaces, whereas before he'd been casual about leaving its screen up on the counter or coffee table. These small changes might have meant nothing, or they might have meant everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late May. David had just stepped outside to take what he claimed was another customer call when his phone rang again. He'd left it on the kitchen counter, forgotten in his haste to answer the call on our landline. I stared at the device as it vibrated against the granite surface, the screen lighting up with an incoming call from the same unknown number that had been disrupting our dinners for months. My heart hammered as I reached for the phone, my finger hovering over the answer button. This was it. This was the moment that would either confirm my fears or put them to rest forever. I could let it ring, preserve whatever illusion of trust remained between us, and continue living with questions that gnawed at me during sleepless nights. Or I could answer it and finally learn the truth about who had been claiming so much of my husband's attention. The phone continued to ring, and I made my choice. The sound that greeted me when I pressed answer wasn't what I expected at all. Instead of a voice, I heard laughter. Rich, melodic female laughter that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep and genuine. Then came the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. "There's my gorgeous man. I was starting to think you'd gotten cold feet about tomorrow night." The voice was sultry, confident, completely at ease. It carried the casual intimacy of someone who had every right to call my husband gorgeous, someone who made plans with him for tomorrow night, while I sat grading papers and planning our weekend grocery trip. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely, as if my body was protecting me from having to respond to something it wasn't equipped to handle. The woman continued, oblivious to my stunned silence. I've been thinking about what you said last week, about how different things could be if we didn't have to sneak around anymore. I know it's complicated with your situation, but Marcus, I'm ready whenever you are. I've already started looking at apartments in Portland like we talked about. There's this amazing loft downtown that would be perfect for us to start fresh. Marcus! She'd called him Marcus. Not David, not Honey, not any of the pet names I'd grown accustomed to over 8 years of marriage. Marcus was apparently who my husband became when he stepped out onto that back porch every evening, phone pressed to his ear, voice soft with affection I'd thought was reserved for me alone. The gallery opening is tomorrow at 7, the woman continued, and I could hear papers rustling in the background, as if she was checking notes or flipping through a calendar. I picked up that navy suit you liked from the dry cleaner, the one that makes your eyes look incredible. God, I can't wait to show you off to everyone. My colleagues have been dying to meet the man who's got me walking around with this ridiculous smile all the time. A gallery opening. A navy suit I'd never seen. Colleagues who knew about their relationship while I remained completely oblivious to her existence. The scope of the deception was staggering. This wasn't a casual affair or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a full relationship, complete with plans and futures and public appearances. Marcus, you're being awfully quiet tonight. Usually you're telling me about your day by now, complaining about your boss or sharing some funny story about the restaurant. She paused, and I heard concern creeping into her voice. Is everything all right? You didn't get bad news about the divorce paperwork, did you? Divorce paperwork. The words hit me like ice water, shocking and clarifying in their brutality. I found my voice, though it came out strangled and unfamiliar. What divorce paperwork? The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, and what sounded like a chair scraping against a floor. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely, stripped of its earlier warmth and replaced with something cautious and afraid. I'm sorry, who is this? Where's Marcus? Marcus is my husband, David, I said, each word feeling like I was swallowing broken glass. And there is no divorce paperwork because we're still very much married. The gasp that came through the phone was sharp and horrified. Oh my God, this can't be happening. He told me. He said he was separated, that the divorce was almost final. He said his wife had moved back to her hometown in Montana, and that they were just waiting for the paperwork to be processed. Montana. I'd never lived in Montana, never even visited Montana, but apparently the fictional version of me had relocated there, clearing the way for my husband to pursue a relationship with this woman who thought she was dating a separated man named Marcus, who worked at a restaurant and was on the verge of being legally free to start a new life. How long? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 9 months, she whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice now. We've been together for 9 months. He told me about you in the beginning, said you'd grown apart, and that the separation had been mutual and amicable. He showed me pictures of the apartment he was renting, said it was temporary until the divorce was final, and he could afford something bigger. 9 months. While I'd been supporting him through his mother's health crisis, planning our upcoming vacation to celebrate our 9th wedding anniversary, and scheduling appointments with the fertility specialist, because we'd been trying to get pregnant, David had been building an entirely separate life with someone else. What apartment? I managed to ask. On Pine Street, the complex near the river, Unit 12A. We spend most of our time there because he said it felt more like home than the place he'd shared with his ex-wife. Her voice broke on the last words. I can't believe this is happening. I'm not the kind of person who gets involved with married men. I would never, ever have started anything if I'd known he was still married. I believed her. The anguish in her voice was real, the shock genuine. She was as much a victim of David's deception as I was, perhaps more so because she'd been living in a complete fantasy, while I at least had the truth of our actual marriage, such as it was. I need to know, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. How did you meet? How did this start? At the restaurant where he works, she said, sniffling. Antonio's on Market Street. I was there for a business dinner, and he was our server. He was so charming and funny, and when he asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime, I said yes. It seemed so innocent at first. Antonio's, the upscale Italian place downtown, where David and I had celebrated our last anniversary. Where he'd been working, apparently, though I'd thought his only job was at the auto dealership. Another lie in what was becoming an endless stack of deceptions. He works at a car dealership, I said numbly. No, he's a server at Antonio's. Has been for 2 years. He talks about it all the time. About the difficult customers and the good tips and his manager Rosa who treats the staff like family. She paused, and I could hear her processing this new information. Unless... Oh God, does he have 2 jobs? Is that why he was always so tired on the weekends? 2 jobs, 2 lives, 2 identities. My husband wasn't just cheating. He was living as a completely different person. The David who came home to me every evening at 6:30 was apparently not the Marcus who worked dinner shifts at an Italian restaurant and was planning to move to Portland with his girlfriend once his fictional divorce was finalized. What's your name? I asked quietly. Amanda, she replied. Amanda Chen. I'm a graphic designer. I have my own studio downtown. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. He probably told you I was nobody special, didn't he? Some meaningless fling that didn't mean anything? He didn't tell me about you at all, I said honestly. I found out by accident when I answered his phone. The silence that followed was heavy with shared devastation. 2 women who'd been loving the same man, neither of us knowing about the other, both of us believing we had his heart and his future and his honesty. The betrayal was multi-layered, complex, designed to keep us both satisfied while David maintained complete control over both relationships. I'm going to be sick, Amanda whispered. 9 months of my life. 9 months of believing I'd found someone special, someone who was going to build a life with me. We were planning to get married once his divorce was final. We picked out rings last month. Rings. They'd been shopping for engagement rings while I'd been researching vacation destinations for our anniversary trip. The parallel lives were so elaborate, so detailed, that I wondered how David had managed to keep track of all the lies. How exhausting it must have been to maintain 2 separate identities, 2 different sets of memories, and plans, and promises. I'm so sorry, I said, and I meant it. I'm sorry this happened to both of us. What are you going to do? Amanda asked. It was a question I couldn't answer because I had no idea. What did you do when you discovered that your entire marriage was built on lies? When the man you trusted with your heart and your future and your dreams turned out to be someone you didn't know at all? I don't know, I admitted. Right now, I'm just trying to understand how this was possible. How someone lives 2 completely different lives without either side knowing about the other. He's very good at compartmentalizing, Amanda said sadly. He told me once that he was good at keeping different parts of his life separate, that it helped him focus on whatever was most important in the moment. I thought he was talking about work stress. I had no idea he meant entire relationships. Through the kitchen window, I could see David still on the back porch, still talking on what I now realized must be a second phone. Was he talking to Amanda's voicemail? To another woman entirely? How many lives was he juggling? How many hearts was he breaking with his elaborate web of deceptions? Does he have another phone? I asked. A work phone, Amanda confirmed. For the restaurant. He said the manager required all servers to have a separate line for scheduling and customer follow-ups. Another lie, I realized. Another careful construction designed to explain away the evidence of his double life. Amanda, I said carefully, I need you to know that I had no idea about any of this. If I'd known he was seeing someone else, I would have told you immediately. No one deserves to be deceived this way. I know, she said quietly. I can hear it in your voice. You're as shocked as I am. She took a shaky breath. What kind of person does this? What kind of person looks someone in the eye every day and lies about everything? It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I answered the phone. The David I'd married was kind, thoughtful, honest to a fault. He returned money when cashiers gave him too much change, stopped to help strangers with flat tires, remembered the names of elderly neighbors, and always asked about their grandchildren. That man wouldn't hurt anyone intentionally, wouldn't build his happiness on someone else's pain. But apparently that man was also capable of creating and maintaining an entirely fictional life for nearly a year. Capable of looking me in the eye every morning and evening while secretly planning a future with someone else. Capable of devastating two women who loved him while somehow justifying it all to himself. "I should let you go," Amanda said after a long pause. I need to figure out what to do with all of this." "Amanda, wait," I said quickly. "Are you okay? I mean, do you have someone you can talk to about this? Family or friends?" "My sister," she said, her voice thick with tears. "She never liked him much anyway. Said there was something about him that felt too good to be true. I should have listened to her." "Don't do that to yourself," I said firmly. "Don't blame yourself for trusting someone who presented himself as trustworthy. This isn't your fault, and it's not mine either. This is David's choice, David's deception, David's responsibility." "You're right," she said quietly. "It's just hard not to feel stupid for believing all of it." "I feel stupid too," I admitted. "I'm supposed to be good at reading people. I work with children all day, and kids are terrible liars. You learn to spot deception from a mile away. But I never saw this coming." "He's very convincing," Amanda said sadly. "That's probably how he managed to fool both of us for so long." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen holding David's phone and trying to process what I'd learned. My husband of 8 years was also Marcus, a restaurant server who'd been planning to marry his girlfriend Amanda once his fictional divorce was finalized. He maintained an apartment I'd never seen, worked a job I'd never known about, and had built an entire relationship based on lies about our marriage being over. The front door opened, and I heard David's footsteps in the hallway. He was humming something under his breath, the same tune he always hummed when he was in a particularly good mood. The sound made my stomach turn because I now knew exactly why he was so happy. He'd just spent 20 minutes talking to the woman he was planning to marry, making plans for their future together while his actual wife sat alone in their kitchen, grading papers and planning grocery lists for a marriage that apparently no longer existed in his mind. "Sorry about that call, sweetheart," he said as he walked into the kitchen, reaching for the refrigerator handle. "You know how Frank gets when he's stressed about monthly numbers? Sometimes I think that man would call me at midnight if he thought it would help his sales reports." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I almost admired the skill involved. If I hadn't just spoken to Amanda, I would have believed him completely. He was that good at deception, that practiced at maintaining his dual identities. "Frank," I repeated, watching his face carefully. "You know how he is," David said, pulling a bottle of water from the fridge. "Always worried about something. Tonight it was the Henderson account. Whether we're going to close the deal before the end of the month." More lies. Elaborate, detailed lies that probably had just enough truth mixed in to make them believable. I wondered how long he'd been practicing this skill, how far back the deception went. Had our entire marriage been built on lies, or was this a recent development? "David," I said quietly, "we need to talk." Something in my tone must have alerted him because he turned to look at me more carefully, his eyes focusing on the phone in my hands. His face went very still, and I watched him recognize his own device and realize what that might mean. "Your phone rang," I said simply. The color drained from his face so quickly that I thought he might faint. His hand tightened around the water bottle, and I heard the plastic crinkle under the pressure. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across our kitchen, the space between us suddenly feeling like an enormous chasm filled with lies and betrayal, and the ruins of everything I'd thought was true. "Sarah," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I talked to Amanda," I said, and watched him crumble. "I know about Marcus, about the apartment, about the restaurant job, about the engagement rings you picked out together last month." David sank into one of our kitchen chairs as if his legs could no longer support him. The confident, charming man who'd walked through the door just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller and desperate and caught in a web of his own making. "How long have you been planning to leave me?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I wasn't," he said quickly, then stopped himself. "I mean, I don't know. It's complicated. It seems pretty simple to me, I replied. You told Amanda you were getting divorced and planning to move to Portland with her. You've been with her for 9 months, which means you've been lying to me for 9 months. What part of that is complicated? David put his head in his hands, and I could see his shoulders shaking. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red with tears. I wasn't sure I believed anymore. How could you trust the emotions of someone who'd been lying to you about everything else? I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. It started as just, I don't know, an escape, I guess. A way to be someone different for a few hours. Someone different, I repeated. You mean someone who wasn't married to me? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, David? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you created an entire identity specifically designed to erase my existence from your life. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on our kitchen table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Do you remember when we first got married, how exciting everything felt? How every day seemed full of possibilities? Yes, I said carefully, not sure where he was going with this. Somewhere along the way, that feeling went away. Not because of anything you did, he added quickly. Just because life became routine. Predictable. I started feeling like I was sleepwalking through my own existence. So you decided to wake up as someone else. When I met Amanda, she saw me as this interesting, available man with a future ahead of him, instead of a married guy with a mortgage and a routine and responsibilities. Being with her made me feel alive again. At the cost of our marriage, I pointed out. I told myself it wasn't hurting our marriage because you didn't know about it, David said miserably. I thought I could keep both lives separate, that I could be Marcus with her and David with you, and somehow that would make me happy enough to be a better husband. How is that supposed to work exactly? I asked. You were planning to marry her. How are you going to explain being married to 2 people? I don't know, he admitted. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out later, that somehow there would be a solution that didn't hurt anyone. I know how that sounds. I know it was stupid and selfish and impossible. It was cruel, I said quietly. Not just to me, but to Amanda too. She fell in love with someone who doesn't exist, someone who is free to love her back. You stole 9 months of her life. I know, he whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it. Why didn't you just ask for a divorce if you were so unhappy? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I needed to understand. Why go through all of this instead of just being honest about what you wanted? Because I didn't want a divorce, David said, looking up at me with desperate eyes. I love you, Sarah. I love our life together, our house, our routines, even the predictability that was driving me crazy. I just wanted to feel like myself again, like someone interesting and desirable and worth choosing. So you chose to become a liar instead. I chose to become someone who could make someone else happy, he corrected. Someone who wasn't a disappointment. You were never a disappointment to me, I said, feeling tears start to burn behind my eyes. Wasn't I? David asked. When's the last time you looked at me the way Amanda looks at Marcus? When's the last time you seemed excited to see me or impressed by something I did or proud to introduce me to your friends? The questions hit me harder than I'd expected because I couldn't immediately answer them. When had I stopped seeing David as the man I'd fallen in love with and started seeing him as simply my husband, as familiar and reliable as the furniture in our living room? That's not an excuse for what you did, I said finally. No, it's not, David agreed. There's no excuse for any of this. I just wanted you to understand that it wasn't about not loving you. It was about not knowing how to love myself anymore. I sat with that admission, trying to understand how we'd gotten so far off track without me noticing. Had I been so focused on the practical aspects of our life together that I'd forgotten to nurture the emotional connection that had brought us together in the first place? Had my efficiency and organization somehow communicated that I didn't need him to be anything more than a reliable presence in our shared routine? What happens now? I asked, echoing the question Amanda had posed to me. I don't know, David said honestly. I've lost Amanda. She'll never forgive me for lying about being married. And I know I've probably lost you too. I don't blame you if you can't get past this. 9 months, David, I said quietly. 9 months of planning a future with someone else, while coming home to me every night and pretending everything was normal. How am I supposed to trust you again? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? I don't know, he repeated, tears streaming down his face now. I don't know if you can. I don't know if you should. I just know that I'm sorry. And I know that I love you. And I know that I never wanted to hurt you this way. But you did hurt me this way, I pointed out. You made a choice every single day for 9 months to continue hurting me. Yes, he said simply. I did. The admission hung between us like a physical presence. There was no arguing with it, no way to minimize it or explain it away. David had chosen his double life every day for 9 months, and now we all had to live with the consequences of those choices. I looked at my husband across our kitchen table, this man I'd shared my life with for 8 years, and realized I had no idea who he really was anymore. Was he the David who brought me coffee in bed and remembered my favorite movies? Or was he the Marcus who worked at a restaurant and planned secret futures with other women? Could he be both? Or was one of them just another performance in an elaborate ongoing deception? I need you to leave, I said quietly. I need space to think about all of this. David nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I'll pack a bag and go to the apartment. The apartment Amanda knows about? I asked. Yes, he said miserably. Though I suppose that relationship is over now. It was over the moment it started, I corrected. It was built on lies from the very beginning. David stood up slowly, like a man much older than his 37 years. Sarah, I want you to know that everything between us was real. Our marriage, our love, our plans for the future. I know it probably doesn't feel that way right now, but it was real for me. I didn't respond because I couldn't. How could any of it have been real if he'd been simultaneously planning a different future with someone else? How could our love have been genuine if he'd been willing to betray it so completely for so long? After David left, taking a hastily packed suitcase and his collection of lies with him, I sat alone in our kitchen and tried to figure out who I was now. The woman who'd woken up that morning had been a wife, a partner in what she'd believed was a loving and honest marriage. The woman sitting here now didn't know what she was anymore, except alone and betrayed, and unsure of everything she'd thought she could count on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.